Thank you. I'm Richard. Does everyone have a LAVA flyer? Good. Okay. We have some more up here if you need them. Lots. Okay. So I should not put this down. Welcome. This is our 26th salon. Okay. Today we have two presentations. Where's Brent? Brent's going to talk first. He's going to talk about this guy. Paul and Didi, raise your hand. You guys are going to talk second. Didi, you're going to present your findings on early Los Angeles neon. Was that a fair way to introduce your talk and give the little teaser? Thank you. Perfect. They're great. Okay. We're going to get started. I'm going to talk for 1 minute and tell you about great stuff coming up that you might not know about. Brent, let's show them your book before I forget. So this is Brent's book, and they can order copies on Amazon.
This is the original hardback. It's now in paperback for $50 at Amazon. I have a couple of the hardbacks, which are like $120. So it's kind of now it's in paperback. You can get them on Amazon.
What's it called?
It's called Mack Sennet's Fun Factory, and that's the talk. Okay. Very quickly, I want to thank everyone for coming. We're going to have about 20 minutes between the two talks, so you can run back down and order an espresso and get an eclair, whatever you need to do. We're very, very happy you're here. After this talk, after this salon, and after every salon till the end of the year, I'm going to be giving about an hour-long free walking tour of Broadway under my Flaneur in the City series. The walk on Broadway has been inspired by the city approving financing for the Strategy 1, Phase 1 of the Broadway Master Streetscape Plan. This is a revisioning of a new Broadway. I don't know if I'm clapping about that. I'm glad you are. I'm glad you're excited. I'm actually pretty anxious. But the point of these walking tours is to raise consciousness and just get people thinking about how important and great Broadway is. And letting, at this point, the only thing that's going to be done is the city's going to do stuff that they have control over. Streets, street lights, curbs. We'll get into all this. So after every salon till the end of the year, we're going to do one of these walks. So hope you can at least sit with us for 20 minutes while I do an introduction and get up to speed. And Paul, you're going to just talk for maybe 45 seconds. Your work on 45 seconds, no more than a minute. 30 seconds.
35.
Paul designed and built the Broadway bar neon sign for Said Moses at Broadway Bar, which is at 9th and Broadway. And so signage is part of the Broadway Master Streetscape Plan. So Paul's a perfectly viable candidate to spend 30 seconds talking about it.
I talk fast.
Things coming up. Kim, what's coming up? The next salon, August, we're going to have two speakers. We're going to have Paul Nugent of the Aetherius Society is going to come, right, and he's going to talk about the Aetherius Society. He's going to talk about Dr. George King, whom he worked with, who came to Los Angeles to found an ashram as based on his esoteric religion, and it's really interesting. It's about Jesus Christ as an avatar and a cosmic master, and it's absolutely fantastic. And then our friend Carlton Davis is going to talk about the Pickle Works building. The Pickle Works building is in the Arts District. It's basically at First in Santa Fe. The Pickle Works building is really important because it is the building where the ordinance Artist in Residence was first implemented. Bill Wax was the brawn behind Artist in Residence, and it created the Arts District. And that's a neighborhood that's getting a lot of attention. So Carlton lived there and had a gallery in the Pickle Works, so he's going to give you an authoritative history of the early Arts District history, which is important. And last thing, we have a crime lab, not until October, but our next crime lab is going to be October 20th, and our good friend Mike is going to talk about the Bluebeard Watson case, which is a case that started the homicide department at the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. It's a 1924 case. 1920, thank you. Bluebeard Watson, James Bluebeard Watson, of course, had about 17 wives and killed perhaps 12 of them. And the resources needed to go over 12 states and convict this guy showed the LASD they needed a homicide department to consolidate resources and maximize, make most efficient use of the resources they had. And then our friend Maylin Cabral, who is the archivist at the California Association of Criminalists, is going to talk about 4 cases in the Los Angeles Police Department between 1920 and 1949, which defined Los Angeles crime and law enforcement. She's going to talk about the Hickman, Marion Parker kidnapping. She's going to talk about the Northcott, that's right, the Northcott chicken coop, Northcott.
Wineville chicken coop murders.
The Wineville chicken coop murders, right. It's all the way out in Riverside County. It's the case that Angelina Jolie based the Changeling on. And she's going to talk about the Black Dahlia case, and then she's just going to talk about Ray Pinker, who founded the criminalistics department at Cal State Los Angeles, where we have these crime labs. So it's going to be great. October 20th, it's all in your booklet. Thank you for coming.
Bukowski Salon.
Yes, because we're talking about October, I just posted last week our Charles Bukowski Literary Salon at the Los Angeles Athletic Club, Saturday, October 26th. I don't know if it's in your booklet, I think it is. Anyway, so there you go. Where's Brent? You're still right there, I love it. Brent, you should probably, if you get much, stand about right here, because the speaker's right there. You're going to stand over here, aren't you? Yeah. Okay, let's get you situated. This will be good. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, here's Brent, and the man on the screen behind him is who he's going to talk about. And Paul, you have your studio next door to the old Sennet studio. Okay.
That is true.
You have a lot to contribute to this salon. Yeah, let's do that.
So we're going to I'm going to start out just with a 5-minute clip, just to give you, if you haven't seen who Mack Sennet is and his films, just one sampling of this comedy that was a pioneer.
We were going to do Wandering Willies.
Yeah. With a pioneer of slapstick comedy.
Oh, I gotta do it in VLC, sorry. I do it in VLC, it'll open up all the way. It'll give me full screen. Brett, why don't you say something while I get this?
Okay. Well, we're going to see a clip from a film called Wandering Willies in 1926, which stars Australian comedian Billy Bevan and directed by Del Ward. And it's by the time that Mack Sennet produced this, he was well established in the motion picture industry as a pioneer, and the king of comedy was what they called, a lot of people started with him. Charlie will go over that.
That's still clip time, honey.
I know, I can't get the other one to open.
Go into view and drop down to full screen.
There we go.
Hey,
thank you.
And yeah, there you go.
I'm not a QuickTime guy, I'm a VLC guy. Thank you.
He's known as a motion picture pioneer and a comedy pioneer, but he also had a lot to do with the development of Los Angeles in the 1910s and the 1920s particularly. So given the scope of the LAVA salons and a lot of like local history, I'm going to try to incorporate some of that into my, if I was doing this somewhere else, not in Los Angeles, I thought we'd just talk about Mack Sennet and all the things he's done, but because of that, there's a lot to tie in. But he was born in rural Quebec, Canada in 1880, of an Irish farming family. It was a part of Quebec that was mostly Irish, and he, the Keystone Cops are what he's known for. That film we just saw was from 1926, and there were some cops in there, but that was almost Sennet doing an homage to his earlier time, because by the 20s he didn't have the comedy cops in his films as much. That was really the Keystone era of the 1910s, and the cops really weren't the stars of the film, other than, you look on the left, is Ford Sterling, who's one of Sennet's early stars, and Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle on the right, who became one of Sennet's biggest stars. The cops really were part of the chase scene at the end usually, and the other thing that he's known for that was kind of sort of distorted as far as if you watch his actual films, it was pie throwing. But some of the early, actually a clip I was going to show you from 1913, and maybe we'll time to see later, has one of the earliest pie in the face. But if you watch his films, even the Keystone films, there's a lot more bricks being thrown than pies, and that's one thing you always notice about Keystone films. And 1914, they're walking down the street of undeveloped parts of Los Angeles. There's always all these bricks laying around that can be picked up and thrown. I think just that's just how in the movies it was. So anyway, Mack Sennet, his family when he was a teenager moved to New England. They were in Connecticut for a little while. Then they were in Northampton, Massachusetts, and he had a operatic voice training. He worked as a Boilermaker. He was kind of always a guy who, in his later years, he wrote his autobiography, King of Comedy. Gene Fowler in the 30s wrote Father Goose, which is the story of Mack Sennet. He always played up as being a coarse Irishman that spit tobacco and chewed cigars and spit them out, which he did. But he did a lot of mythologizing about himself. And despite all that, he was always somebody, he was trained in opera. His mother always did singing lessons. He was always attuned to what was happening on Broadway, where when he was a teenager, maybe 18, he went to New York. This was around the turn of the century, 1900. And he was initially in some singing groups, but he started becoming a chorus boy in some of the Broadway plays going on then. He worked with some of the people that he later hired, like Eddie Foy, Raymond Hitchcock, who were big, major Broadway stars at the time. And by the late, like 1907, he got his first part where he actually had a speaking part in a show had John Barrymore in it later on as a star. But Sennet also, he worked as a model. This is a postcard that there's several different versions of this, and nowhere does it say Mack Sennet. It's Stanley Brady and Miss Cousin Blue Rock and the Virginian. They sent these various postcards out that had nothing to do with anything other than doing a scene, and it's obviously Sennet in this. And it probably was right about the time in 1908 when he entered motion pictures in New York with the Biograph Studio as an actor. And right after he entered, this is the gentleman in the middle, D.W. Griffith, who's one of the pioneer directors. This is a little bit later with Cecil B. DeMille on the left, D.W. Griffith in the center, and Mack Sennet on the right. This is the late 1910s when they were all pretty well established as major producers and directors in Hollywood. When Sennet started, Griffith started directing films, and Sennet would have mostly Griffith's specialty was mostly the dramatic films. Here's an early one, Arcadian Maid, where starring Mary Pickford, 1909, and Sennet's playing kind of the villain. He's an Italian peddler who takes advantage of her or whatever in this film. But he also early on established first of all, he established writing ability because he wrote a couple of scenarios for Griffith. One of them was The Lonely Villa, which is one of Griffith's best known melodramas at the time, which also had Mary Pickford. But he showed a comedy flair, and in early 1909, Sennet starred in a film called The Curtain Pole. And this is filmed in Fort Lee, New Jersey. Sennet was always, he watched the French comedies of the first decade of the 1900s, Pathé, released, and Zecca, director Zecca, and some of the things to be, these French comedies. If you ever seen them, they're heavily made up. There's a lot of trick effects. There's George Méliès, but these are a little bit more slapstick oriented. They usually had some comedy cops, which is where Sennet got the Keystone Cops from. And here's at the end of The Curtain Pole, but this is Sennet in makeup. And in 1911, because the Biograph, they were getting a lot of requests for comedies, and Griffith didn't really like to make comedies, so he elevated Sennet to become director of a second unit at Biograph, making comedies, which were usually on the backside of us. Back in those days, it was a split reel release, which was 2 5-minute films on one reel. And Biograph was releasing, the top half of the split reeler was a D.W. Griffith drama, and they released these Mack Sennet directed farce comedies in the back end. And Mabel Normand on the right was one of his early stars, and they had a personal relationship. There's a lot of mythology that Sennet, it's hard to even trace. So they were going to be married, and this and that, and it never happened. And this is would be Shriner, 1912. The thing is, during the Biograph years, the Biograph studio was based in New York, and by 1908, I think the first studio here in Los Angeles, the Selig studio, opened, which was actually, I think, over at Chinese Laundry in downtown Los Angeles, and they later moved to Alessandro Street, Glendale Boulevard in Edendale, which is where Sennet also, the studio was. The next year, the Bison studio, which was the studio that became the Keystone studio, but 3 years later, opened on that same stretch. So Edendale, which now people consider part of Echo Park, was really the first Hollywood. Fort Lee, New Jersey was maybe the first, movie mecca where the studios were. Then, but they realized because of the weather, they would locate here after a few other starts in Jacksonville, Florida, and other places. But the Biograph studio was always based in New York, and they would, almost like a vaudeville troupe, in the winter, maybe the fall, they would take a train west and make films. They set up camp in Los Angeles for 4 or 5 months during the deepest winter years, and they would make films. Then they would return the following spring to New York. So Sennet did this several times. That was his first exposure to Los Angeles. Probably the first time that the Biograph troupe came out. And by the time he made this film, it was early in 1912, and this is called The Would-Be Shriner. The Shrine Parade was happening in downtown Los Angeles. He had his comedian friend Mace, who's on the left there. Actually, Sennet himself was still starring in a lot of his films. You see him with the fez up there. He gets into the Shrine Parade and disrupts it, and putting on a shrine costume and things. And Sennet, not long after that, went back east with the Biograph troupe in 1912. But he had been directing, hundreds of these short films for Biograph, and there were two Adam Kessel and Charles Bowman had a company called the New York Motion Picture Company they were making the Bison Westerns in Los Angeles that Thomas Ince was producing and directing, and that was the Bison Studio. And they signed Sennet to make comedies. They formed the Keystone Film Company, which up until that point there had never been a film company that only made comedies. And Sennet took his troupe, his Ford Sterling, Fred Mace, Mabel Norman as his principal comedians, as well as himself still. At that point he was directing, producing, writing, and appearing in the films. They shot in the summer of 1912. They did a number of films in New York and around Coney Island, around Fort Lee. And then in August of 1912, they came west and they took over the Bison Studio, which became the Keystone Studio. And here it is in its early days. And this is what's now Glendale Boulevard. Before, the one thing that remains of the studio, you'll see in the later shots, is a stage that wasn't built yet. There's now a Jack-in-the-Box on this site. It's Glendale Boulevard and FE. So, and at the Keystone Studio, a lot of the original studios, not only the Keystone Studio, but the Selig Studio, there's another studio on the street. They all had this mission kind of motif. That was the early film studios in Los Angeles. They so only have them with the mission bell kind of look for some reason. And he was making the film. This is a film from 1913, The Stolen Purse. Sennet's on the left. The guy who would become his second director, Henry Pathé Lehrman, is in this center. Ford Sterling and then Fred Mace. These were all some of his major stars. And here's Sennet as a prison guard about to fry Ford Sterling, convict. Raymond Hatton as the other guard. He went on a long career as a character actor. Dick Cogley. And Mabel was immediately popular as one of Sennet's big stars. This is Mabel's dramatic career that Sennet appeared in as her boyfriend. And you see Mabel on the screen. She leaves the rural area where they are from, runs off to the city, becomes a movie star, and Sennet goes after her and doesn't realize that what a motion picture is. He sees on the screen a villain accosting her, so he gets out a gun and starts shooting up the theater. And here's a rare behind-the-scenes look at the early Keystone Studio. I mean, it was really a claptrap affair for many years. Just they were still doing the open-air shooting with diffusers, using the natural light. The Klieg lights that later became in use were a couple of years away from being developed. And there's Sennet and Fred Mace on the left, and Mabel Norman and Henry Lehrman. This is a film called The Sluice of the Floral Parade, which they actually, in January 1st, 1913, Rose Parade, or Terminal Roses Parade, Sennet actually had a float in the parade and filmed some things around the float and then made a comedy with a plot. And this was back in the studio, but it is from that film. But he was also, that was, already he had been in Los Angeles 4 months, and he was already involved, with having a float in the Rose Parade. Here's Sennet going into his office, and if you compare this to the office of most, entertainment business executives today, I don't think they would have, a wall with peeling paint and, but it was literally, he was just kind of operating on the seat of his pants. This is from 1917, they're talking about the first Keystone Studio was just a shanty. Well, it's the same studio, and it started 5 years earlier, but this is the studio a little bit later, after the permanent stage that's still there. This is looking like, the distance would be Elysian Park, Chavez Ravine, and this is pretty much, they had the 3 big stages that were, and then they had the new big stage that was the one that they used, the Klieg lights. But they continued to use the natural light for years, even after they built that stage. And this is from January 1914 in the LA Times. You can see that Sennet is making the point that he's thanking Los Angeles for its support, and he's assuring them that unlike traveling concerns, the film companies do not carry money out of town. On the contrary, it brings large amounts from all over the world. So he's letting the city know that he's investing in Los Angeles. And this is a telegram, but about the same time, just after he signed Charlie Chaplin, who probably is his biggest discovery of all the discoveries he had, which were a lot of them. You can see this, they're sending a telegram to him. Actually, it says Mack Sennet, so they aren't even, this is from the Home Office in New York. And actually doing this right here is kind of significant for Mack Sennet because we're basically halfway between Sennet's two residences between the years 1912 and 1920. Because from the time he got into Los Angeles, I mean, at that time, the big hotel where a lot of the big traveling stage people would stay was the Alexandria Hotel. And then there was,
Which is that 5th and Spring.
yeah, and then at 4th and Main was the Van Nuys Hotel, which I think now is the Hotel Barclay. And that was another big hotel, and that's where Sennet took up residence. You can see his address here is Van Nuys Hotel, Los Angeles.
Brent, could you read that to us? I can't read it.
Okay, well, this was, one thing you have to understand about Sennet, he was contracted to make these one-reel, the split reelers and then one reel, which is a minute, a 10-minute short. And they were distributing them through the Mutual Company, which was one of the big distributors at that time. Sennet on his own always wanted to get bigger. He on his own started making two-reelers, which at those days, those were really long. And Mutual started refusing to take them because he was falling behind the one-reelers. He would also make a feature film, Tilly's Punctured Romance, in 1914, which was the first comedy feature film. But he was, as a result, he was always behind at this point in production. So this is the Mutual Company in New York. Actually, it's the New York Motion Picture Company in New York, Hessel and Bowman, saying, just received telegram stating there are 6 New York and 6 Keystone companies now working. We'll send extra stock as requested. We'll be compelled to skip a few releases of Keystones unless we arrive this week. Little Billy's Triumph, Mabel's Bear Escape, and Making a Living, which would be the Charlie Chaplin's debut film. And enough negatives next week to enable us to book for February 5th, 7th, and 9th. We cannot run so close. It takes 1 week at least to get posters, and we must ship to exchange at least 1 week in advance of release dates. Our contract calls for us to notify the Mutual. Actually, I didn't put the second part of the telegram, but it's basically New York Motion Picture Company saying, get those films here. What was I going to say? This was. At the time, the Keystone films were immensely popular. I mean, they were just, the theaters, people just couldn't get enough of this because there were a lot of factors in these films that Sennet he was the broad comedy, he was satirizing the melodramas and the dramatic films. Even he satirized a lot of Griffith's films, which today in context, if you see some of the early films where it looks like a lot of people just running around doing crude things, but they're actually spoofing. There's some where they're spoofing some of the Griffith intercutting last minute rescues and the motifs that would be like the equivalent of today, where they're satire. We all know there's Scary Movie is or whatever, or spoofing the horror films, and that's what a lot of what Sennet was doing. And so anyway, he was living at the Van Nuys Hotel until 1915, which is a few blocks that way. Then in 1915, he moved into a room at the Los Angeles Athletic Club, which is where he lived until 1920, when he ended up renting a mansion off of Washington and a little bit of a little bit west, but the Los Angeles Athletic Club was very significant. Not just at that time, a lot of the bachelors, film people, Charlie Chaplin, Douglas Fairbanks, lived there as well. That was kind of a common thing for, you know, unmarried men when they go to a town. It's, you know, the room at the athletic club. But Sennet was also always very, he had a workout regimen. He was really into boxing. And he would hire a lot of people for his films from the athletic club. A lot of his stunt people at the LA Athletic Club for many years was known for its high diving, its swimming and high diving. And the high divers made for great stunt people because a lot of his films, and this is the days when, you know, somebody was expected to jump off a cliff onto just, you know, a mattress, and if they said, I'm not sure about this, it's like, okay, you're fired, we'll get somebody else. So a lot of the guys, like in this picture, this is, in those days they called the stunt men, they called them bunk men or the iodine squad. And these are some of the guys. The guy on the left is a guy named Hal Haig Priest, who was a high diver at the LA Athletic Club. And later, he was in the 1920 Olympics along with Duke Kahanamoku and other, and he was famous. He lived to 104. That was probably the early 2000s. He finally came clean when he was 104 years old. And he had a big thing because in 1920, he and several other of the swimmers, who a lot of them were from the LA Athletic Club, the men's Olympic swimmers. I think this was in Antwerp, Belgium. I forget where that Olympics was, but they stole an Olympic flag. And he had it all those years, and he was at that point living, I think, in Philadelphia area. And so 80 years later, you know, he had the ceremony of giving back the flag he stole. But Sennet hired a lot of people. The guy with the white derby hat and the mustache, George Gray, was a high diver with Dr. Carver's diving horses, which there were several Sennet people, Bobby Dunn and Billy Gilbert, who were, you know, with the diving horses, who were in Atlantic City Steel Pier and different things. And, you know, so these guys, also a lot of boxers, both from the LA Athletic Club and Vernon Arena, which was the hotbed for boxing then. Sennet would hire, I mean, and it's amazing because Sennet, besides his ability to identify the talents like Charlie Chaplin, Gloria Swanson, Harry Langdon, etc., he also had a knack for taking people and training them. And there was always, even in the 30s, when so many of his people became big directors and writers and his cinematographers. And you know, one of the boxers, Alan McNeil, he was Kid McNeil. He trained him into becoming an editor, and he ended up winning an Oscar, I think, for the Oxbow incident in the 1940s. You know, he took these people. So he took a lot of athletics people from, and also female swimmers. Eileen Allen was his top stunt woman at the time, and she later went back to the athletic club. She was a champion swimmer. She coached, I think, Esther Williams and Pat McCormick and all these people. And probably the most famous of the female LA Athletic Club alumni hired by Sennet was Marie Prevost, who she wasn't a star swimmer like some of the other Ivy Crossway and Eileen Allen, but she was a swimmer at the LA Athletic Club. Sennet hired her, and she, you know, was one of Sennet's bathing beauties and went on to become a big star in the 20s. So this is Sennet with her about 1921 from one of his feature films when he had a little bit more lavish budget, Small Town Idol. So, you know, the Keystone Cops, there's kind of this whole thing about, later on in the 1970s, there were these guys who were like, I'm the last of the original Keystone Cops. You know, there were several things like that would come up, and the reality is there were no original, I mean, there may have been an original Keystone Cops, but it changed from film to film, and it was like, hey, you five guys, go to the wardrobe and get some, you know, cop costumes. And a lot of times they didn't even have, you know, the uniforms weren't the same. One guy would have the, you know, the tall, you know, bobby hat. Someone would have a short hat. And this is like the earliest I've ever actually seen. This is from the January 1914. I think it's the Photo Players Ball, something ad taken out, and it's a compliment with Keystone Cops. And these are some of the guys, you know, Hank Mann in the upper left, this is W.D. Mann, became a comedian, well-known. Bill Hopper on the bottom left was one of Sennet's best stuntmen, and one of the, he also, the comedian Larry Seaman that was very popular in the 20s, that he was, more or less, he played Larry Seaman in Long Shots doing all the stunts. Grover Legan, Billy Gilbert was a different Billy Gilbert. He was the guy that was a high diver, different from the sound era Billy Gilbert, who's more well-known. Al St. John, Roscoe Arbuckle's nephew, who became a comedian in his own right. So there really weren't, these were some of the guys who were off in Keystone Cops. But speaking of Arbuckle, here's Arbuckle and Mabel Norman, who became some of Sennet's biggest stars. They did a bunch of films together, and Sennet just kept creating these stars. Charlie Chaplin on the left, he joined Sennet in December 1913. He made 35 films, including Tilly's Punch of Romance, the one feature. And he got signed away by the SNA company for, what at the time, an astounding amount of money. And that constantly happened to Sennet. He would find people, and they would get hired away for a lot more money. And it wasn't, people say, well, he's a cheapskate or whatever, but he had a limited budget. He was an independent, and he always knew he had the ability to find more people with talent, which he always did. Chester Conklin was another one of his mainstays. Here's this recently surfaced, and this is in Santa Monica. That during this time there was the Santa Monica road race, which actually was on the streets of Santa Monica. I think it was Nevada, which became Wilshire, and around the old soldiers' home, which is now the Veterans Hospital and grounds, Ocean. And in 1914, they held the prestigious Vanderbilt Cup, which was a big auto race. A lot of the big Barney Oldfield and Teddy Tetzlaff and a lot of the big racers were in that. And Keystone made a comedy with Charlie Chaplin on the left, and then Mabel Norman, Harry McCoy. And at the same time, they were shooting a film around that called Mabel at the Wheel, the Mutual comic brand. There were some actors from that as well, Kay Tincher and Baldy Belmont. And Sennet actually was involved in racing. He had a car, a Fiat Racer, that he entered in a lot of races, driven by a guy named Dave Lewis. And actually, while in testing for this race, Sennet's car, which in the film they mounted cameras on the back of the car, which is really early, I think, for that during the race, and then they shot films around it. But I think in testing his car, his driver had an accident by the old soldiers' home, and I think one of the old soldiers, a spectator, was killed in that accident. And then later on, about 2 years later, they had another, during this race, one of Sennet's cinematographers was killed when a car and several other people went out of control and into the where people were standing. So it was a lot of danger in those days. Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle in Hollenbeck Park with his nephew Al St. John, one of his comedies. Arbuckle at the gates in front of the Keystone Studios. And another unit, the Chester Conklin unit, Fred Fishback on the left, and the director Walter Wright on the right. I think this is probably right next to, this is probably on Aaron Street, next to where the studio was. And I'm not sure if some of those houses are probably still there. And in 1915, Mack Sennet, D.W., who's in the middle, D.W. Griffith on the right, and Thomas Ince, who's behind Charlie Chaplin on the left. A new company was formed, the Triangle Film Company, which took like 3 of the biggest producers together in a company that would release their films. And this was a 4th of July barbecue in Edendale on the studio grounds. 1915, and Chaplin, this is 6 months after he'd left Sennet, but they remained friends, and Chaplin was dropping by for a visit. And of course, you've seen that movie, The Cat's Meow, the fictitious, entertainment fictitious. Thomas Ince was the guy who, he actually died of natural causes. He wasn't murdered. It's pretty well established, but they were alleging that William Randolph Hearst shot him on his boat trying to shoot Charlie Chaplin because he was messing around with Marion Davies, but he missed and got Thomas Ince. That's the crux of the rumor, but the reality, I know a lot of people that have researched in depth, and he was, he died of other causes. He was ill and taken to San Diego for a while, and there was no gunshots involved at all. But anyway, the new Triangle films gave Sennet a lot bigger budget for his films. This is from Stolen Magic from 1915. He also hired a lot of the big Broadway stars, including ones that had worked for him, or he had worked in their Broadway shows, Raymond Hitchcock, Eddie Foy, Weber and Fields, a lot of big names. But some of his biggest discoveries were the people that he took out of nowhere, like Gloria Swanson in the middle with Bobby Vernon. They had a little team, they were kind of a romantic team, but with slapstick in the Sennet comedies, and Gloria Swanson went from here to working with Cecil B. DeMille and becoming one of the biggest stars of the 20s, but she was really a Sennet that gave her star. Now, about 1917, Sennet also got a movie theater, the Woodley Theater, which it was about 2 blocks here. You see the address on here, 838 South Broadway. It was the Woodley Theater, then it was the Victory Theater, the Mission Theater, I think, then the Victory Theater. Then in about 1923, he sold it, and the people that bought that and on the grounds, it was leveled, and on its site today is the Orpheum Theater, that whole block. This was a much smaller theater, so this was where the Orpheum Theater is now. And he was producing, you see this Bathing Girls Parade in Venice. At this point, his bathing beauties were very popular. He was sending out postcards, and he started a lot of stars, Phyllis Haver and different people now. The Mack and Mabel story is one of those mythological things that it's hard to even get all the facts, and people like Minta Durfee and Adela Rogers St. John in later years were like the only survivors, gave all these stories, which it's hard to substantiate how they were. In 1915, they were supposedly engaged to be married. I mean, I've never seen any like newspaper announcements that they were engaged, but if they would have. But supposedly, Mabel caught Mack with another actress, Mae Bush, and there was some kind of a scuffle. Supposedly, Mae Bush threw a vase that hit Mabel, and it, hurt her very seriously. She was very seriously ill. At the time, they also mentioned she was hurt in a stunt, she was this and that. It's hard to know. The only thing is that she was definitely incapacitated for a while. And then when she came back, she went with Roscoe Arbuckle to new studios, Triangle Studios in New Jersey, in Fort Lee, to make some films for a couple months, supposedly to get away from Sennet. But Sennet then, in order to get her back in his good graces or whatever, or she was also, there were rumors that she was going to go, move elsewhere. He formed the Mabel Normand Feature Film Company to make feature films starring Mabel Normand. And he built the studio, which is Fountain, Bates and Effie, which is the one that's most recently, in the last couple of months, opened up as the Mack Sennet Studios, which had been a drapery and scene shop for years after being a film studio. And she made the feature film here, Mickey, and that ended up being the only film really that she made. Then she went to Goldwyn, and Sennet leased that studio to Thomas Ince and William S. Hart. This Sennet he started issuing these Mack Sennet weeklies to keep abreast of what was happening in the Sennet studio. This is all about Mickey, and Mickey, even though the films were silent, there were scores that were written for the big theaters, but there were also songs written that publicized the film. And Sennet hired a songwriter, Harry Williams, who was one of the big ragtime songwriters, and he and his partner, Edgar Van Alstyne, wrote a song called Mickey for this film, and it became one of the big hit songs of that era, 1918. So this is Sennet Studio in Keystone, and by 1917, Sennet left Keystone, and he sold the Keystone rights, and it became the Mack Sennet Comedies, releasing through Paramount. For the rest of his years, it would be the Mack Sennet Comedies. Here's the studio a little bit later with the cyclorama on the right, and Sennet, he would still occasionally appear in a film. But by 1918, he pretty much retired other than cameo appearances. He was running things. He had a tower built high up in the studio where he could watch the production on the lot. Here he is observing F. Richard Jones directing Louise Fazenda, another one of his popular comedians at the time. Ben Turpin, Phyllis Haver, another one of his big bathing beauties, and Heine Conklin, or some other of his big stars at this time, Calipasha, James Finlayson, the later worked with Laurel and Hardy, Charlie Murray, and a bunch of the bathing beauties in the back. As I mentioned, the two big, two of the big ones, Gloria Swanson and Phyllis Haver, went on to big things. And Sennet even had a song written, Help, Help, Mr. Sennet, I'm drowning in a sea of love. From the point of view of a bathing beauty.
Where the heck are we going to wrap it up?
Okay, so anyway, in the 20s, Sennet continued, and 1927, he moved
to the line. Go back.
These are some of the things now, because a lot of the films were filmed in the Echo Park. You saw that clip, it was Echo Park, Silver Lake area. He moved to Studio City, tore down his studio in Edendale, and he was there for 5 years. He went bankrupt, and that studio became Republic Pictures, and today is CBS, where they film so many TV shows, CBS Studio Center, so W.C. Fields and Bing Crosby. He ended up retiring, after he went bankrupt. He was living in Hollywood, one of the Shakers. He died in 1960. So this is the studio, the first studio today, and the CBS Center now has the Mack Sennet building. So, if you have any other questions, feel free to.
First of all, thank you.
Eventually, it's a significant time anyway. So.
Question.
Yes.
The CBS studios, is there anything remaining there of what Mack Sennet built in 1928?
Yeah, actually right here, the administration building, which is called the Mack Sennet building, and the 2 stages and several buildings around there were. But they built onto it later. I have a picture here. But you can see what it looks like in his day there. Well, anyway, but yeah, the front part of it is still what was his. Any other questions?
Dr. Bullock.
Yeah, he never made copies.
No, he made talkies from 1929 till 1933, and W.C. Fields, he made some shorts with him. He gave Bing Crosby his start as an actor. It was just singing career, but he was kind of surpassed by Hal Roach, who had the Laurel and Hardy and Our Gang and Charlie Chase, and he lost a lot of money in the Wall Street crash, and kind of that, in addition to all the bank failures that affected the studios that were distributing his films and not getting the money, he ended up having to go bankrupt.
What's the question? Where's the name Keystone?
He said that they took it from the Pennsylvania Railroad, and they took the logo, the Keystone logo as well.
Where's this picture?
That is the Sennet studio in Edendale, just before it got torn down. This is the pool, dilapidated. Now on its spot, there's still the building that would be behind here. The big stage is the only thing that's still there as part of the public storage. There's a Jack in the Box right about where, that spot, but. Well, it was probably, but she said, what got me interested in this? There were these, on TV, in the 60s and 70s, there were these films like Old Age of Comedy, when comedy was king, the comedy capers, they would show the old comedies, and I saw some of the Sennet film, like The Chase we saw at the beginning. I kind of got interested in what's behind all this, and I just sort of started accumulating information, and then it kind of became a book over the years. It was just
The
Yes.
early studios that you mentioned in Edendale on Glendale Boulevard, what would have been the cross street?
It was Effie is on one side and Aaron was on the other.
Aaron and
Yeah, it would be just before you're going up to where the Glendale Freeway starts if you're heading east.
Thank you.
And this is the second studio, which is still, he built it so well that it outlives him by, many years. Yes.
Curious where he's buried.
He's buried in Holy Cross Cemetery in Culver City. Not too far actually from Bing Crosby.
One more question.
Right back.
When he went bankrupt, so what happened to the studio immediately after the bankruptcy?
Well, like I said, it became Republic Pictures for about 20 some years, and Gene Autry, Roy Rogers, John Wayne, etc. serials were made there, and then it became CBS. But this studio, the first studio was pretty much by the 30s leveled, except for the one big stage that remained, which it became a roller rink. Then it became a dance hall for a while called the Palace Barn, where Tex Ritter and his Western Caravan played in the 40s. Then it became an Allied Van Lines. And most of the films were filmed right along, like we saw the Riverside Drive. The films we saw, he was involved with the real estate. Silver Lake, Hollywoodland was probably the best thing known. He was best known thing that he was involved in. So.
We gotta wrap this.
All right.
Everyone,
Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you. Yeah, we're going to take a break. We're going to get you do an AV check with you right now. All right, 1:15. We're back. We're going to talk about neon. That's Paul and Dedia. So, thank you. We'll be right back. Next what? Just a couple minutes after one, so about 10, 15 minutes. Good. Good.